Hi there, you guys. How you all doing? Welcome to the littlest parish in Christendom, the Holy Shed. I hope you're having a good day. And you may remember that last week I was talking a bit about metaphors and that the only way we can speak of God is with metaphors. There is no direct way to describe God. There's no language with which to describe God in a literal way. And I'm very pleased with responses that I got from people about that and how helpful you found that. A couple of responses that I just mentioned. Val, for instance, she said a useful metaphor to consider might be God as parent, a neutral term. She says, I was fortunate to have loving parents who gave me every encouragement to learn and grow and to pursue those things I was interested in, to develop fully as a person, and who loved me whatever I did. That sort of love is how I can see God. And as for those pictures of God, she says, clothed in white with a gold crown, seated high and lifted up on a throne, while we all lie prostrate in front of him, also clothed in white. What a dreadful way to spend eternity, she says. And that's great, obviously, that Val had parents whose love for her, whose parenting of her was something so wonderful and so affirming that she can sense and see God in that. Not everybody is like that with their parents, but many of us are, which is great. And Rosie, she came up with an interesting one. She said, I think the Welsh word cwtch is a lovely non-gendered word for how we can think about God. It's a word that speaks about, I think, comfort and warmth and acceptance. So that's great. On a slightly different tack, I was really pleased to get a message from Jane who said, thought you'd be pleased to learn that in the retreat house where I'm staying, they have How to Be a Bad Christian filed under inspirational fiction. Hope that's a metaphor. She says, you're cheek by jowl with Miss Reed's Fairacre books. Fantastic. Good to know. Now, anyway, one of our favourite books, me and Pat's, one of our favourite books that we actually listened to it in the car this year was called God is an Octopus. Fantastic, isn't it? God is an Octopus. And the subtitle is Loss, Love, and a Calling to Nature, and it's by Ben Goldsmith. It's a fantastic book, which is primarily about the author's bereavement and the consequent pain after the death of his 15-year-old daughter, Iris. And quite a lot of it is about the spiritual paths that he explored in search of some kind of comfort and explanation for the death of Iris. It's all very moving, very interesting, very nicely written. But the book also follows Ben Goldsmith's passion for nature, his grief. It's another kind of loss, actually, his grief at the wholesale trouncing of natural habitats by modern farming and by the irrepressible consumerist demands that are placed upon the land. And this is something which he's clearly determined to do something about. He actually owns a farm down here in Somerset, actually, where he has made drastic moves to actually give his farm over to a process of wilding. And he is a wildness freak, you could say, in the very best possible sense. And as such, he's part of a growing movement in this country and elsewhere for the rewilding of nature. It's an initiative about returning nature to itself, really, and to learn to work with nature instead of against it. The book is a fabulous read on so many levels, but what grabbed me about this rewilding thing was thoughts about spiritual rewilding, because just as nature has been adversely domesticated, I think religion also is often domesticated. God is domesticated in our eyes and in our understanding. So there's a need, I think, to get back to the wild roots of religion, to the wildness of God. The original religious impulse in human beings, I think, emerges from two significant felt needs, which often pull against each other. First is a need to connect with that which is greater than ourselves, however we define that, God or whatever. And through this, to discover deeper meaning to our lives. So that's the one. And then the second thing is that there's this need of security against whatever we sense as threatening to our well-being. Back in the mists of time, the greatest threat was from the elements, of course. And that's still a factor to us today. You only have to be looking at the news lately to see how, we as human beings are very much at the mercy of the elements, especially with the effects of climate change that are racing more and more upon us. But our well-being is also threatened very often by many other things that just feel beyond our control. So let's think a little bit about these two basic human needs. The first one, the need to sense, if you like, transcendence, that which is greater, and to sense meaning, I think is a consequence of what we may now call spiritual intelligence. And this is a capacity only recently named as such, and yet evident throughout human history. For a long time, intelligence was something that was identified almost entirely with reason, with cognitive and rationalizing skills measured by this scale of IQ. But in the 1980s, Howard Gardner wrote a book which altered this drastically by pinpointing multiple intelligences, including musical, physical, and emotional. Emotional intelligence, of course, has now very much entered popular conscious and public discourse. But then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, it became possible through collective evidence from psychology, from neurology, I thought I got that wrong there, anthropology and cognitive sciences, to identify another cue which Gardner missed in his 1980s analysis of it. And this has been called SQ, or spiritual intelligence, which is perhaps the most fundamental intelligence because it kind of becomes an overarching source of guidance to the other intelligences. SQ focuses on values and meaning. So, like when we ponder a moral dilemma or we try to make sense of some harrowing situation, like Ben Goldsmith does in his book, Bereavement, or when we sense wonder and awe or feel a deep connectedness with people around us or with the world, these are all ways of exercising spiritual intelligence. SQ is the intelligence that places our lives within a wider, richer, more meaningful context. It's the intelligence that we use to ask the question, why? Not just what or how, but why. It's been said that rather than simply playing within the accepted boundaries, as other intelligences do, SQ has a propensity to play with the boundaries, to shift the goalposts, if you like. In other words, it's the intelligence that prompts us to criticize or question the status quo. It allows us to imagine situations and possibilities that may not yet exist. And so you could say that it's got a kind of wildness about it, a nonconformity. There's a rebelliousness, a freedom about spiritual intelligence. And whilst it's often channeled through and should be challenged through religious traditions, SQ actually has got no necessary connection to religion. It's more fundamental, really, than religion. In itself, it neither requires nor precludes things like belief in God. So, and this is evident to me by observation, humanists and atheists may sometimes have very high SQ, whilst actively religious people, not so much. They may demonstrate precious little spiritual intelligence. And I think that, churches really should be colleges, universities of spiritual intelligence. But sometimes I have to say they're pretty spiritually dumb, if we're honest about it. There is no intelligence sharing going on. It's an awful lot of blah, blah, blah. We could, in fact, say that spiritual intelligence is prior to religious belief, because we're talking about that part of us that seeks religious meaning in the first place. It's that out of which religion emerges. There'd be no longing for God, for instance, or for deeper meaning to life without spiritual intelligence. It's what prompted our ancient forebears sitting around fires to gaze up into the heavens and wonder why there was something rather than nothing, to delve into the significance of existence, their own and that of everything else. So that's one thing. Then the other felt human need is for security in an oft-times chaotic and threatening world. We need to sense and to feel that we're within some sense of order and control. And that's why there is the need, perhaps, to feel that there's someone in charge, of things, someone or something maintaining order, a ruler of all that is. The gods, it would have been in ancient times, but now for many of us, that figure would be God. So religion has this basic tension at its very core between, on the one hand, wildness and freedom born of spiritual intelligence that dislikes, that kicks against rules and borders and conformity, and then on the other hand, the other side of this tension, order and control, a neat and tidy world born out of this longing for settledness and security. So these two things, I think, are right at the core of the whole religious project, whichever religion we're talking about, and the one is constantly pulling against the other. Now, it's not that one's a goodie and one's a baddie. Both of these needs are understandable, both are legitimate. And we can see that religious traditions are constantly wrestling with this tension between them and their diverse concerns. I often, say I like to think of religious tradition as being like a river. Now rivers need both a flow of water, which of itself is kind of wild and free, and a river bed, which channels and holds the river. It's a symbiotic relationship. Without a riverbed, a river basically becomes a flood. The water's dissipated. Without a rich flow of water, what is the bed? It's just a dry old empty hollow cutting through the landscape. So applying this to what we are saying, religious organizations and institutions, churches, can sometimes become over-focused on the security and self-preservation aspect, and so they end up being conservative in their attitudes sociologically and in their theologies and religion and so on. They become conservative, safe, and restrictive with rules and orthodoxies that, contain the river, if you like, that sort of squeeze it in. Now, that's how new spiritual movements tend to come about. That rebellion against the constrictions of the bed, if you like. So, like wild renegade creeks or brooks or rivulets that are seeking freedom, new religious movements sometimes pop out of what they feel and sense as being a restrictive environment to find greater freedom. And the institutions of churches, which are left behind when people have left and moved out somewhere else, well, they can easily become crusty old riverbeds, left high and dry with just a trickle or a small flow of water. It doesn't have to happen that way, but it often does. In this process, religious leaders often end up as the defenders of some particular brand of conservatism, which, by the way, can be on the fundamentalist kind of literalist side or on the liberal. There are liberal orthodoxies, which are kind of, blind, as well as the more literalist ones. But the point is, whichever side of that spectrum it is, there's a preoccupation with tidying things up organisationally or theologically, upholding the party line. This is what we believe. This is how we do things. And as soon as that statement's said, it implies, and we don't want you to mess with it. It's worth noting, that Christianity has more creeds and confessions of faith, more catechisms and doctrinal treatises than any other religious tradition. It's been a big preoccupation within Christianity. Orthodoxies and required forms of belief abound within Christian tradition. Now, clearly, I'm not saying that beliefs and theology are unimportant. Of course not, any more than riverbeds are unimportant. We need shape and structure, but we also need freedom to think outside of the boundaries, to be authentic in doing that without someone bashing us over the head, burning us at the stake, or telling us that we're, heretics. What I'm saying is that a healthy tradition, which is a kind of riverbed itself, a healthy tradition isn't, to switch metaphors, a single-minded monologue. That's traditionalism. A healthy, properly functioning tradition is a dialogue, a multilogue actually, a debate, an open debate, a spiritually intelligent argument that doesn't close the conversation down with imposed orthodoxy and threats toward people who don't conform. People who hold values and ideas which are different. So I think that, a healthy movement, a healthy organization, church or whatever, is one that can hold on to a diversity of views without drawing lines and saying, if you're outside of that line, well, bye-bye, you can't be part of us. So the rewilding of nature, which I'm advocating, is the recovery of diversity for churches, institutions, for other Christian groups, so that they can become hotbeds of different currents, undercurrents, different ideas and imaginations, sparked by thriving spiritual intelligence, which is being nurtured at the core. And if we're going to have thriving spiritual intelligence, then people have to be not only accepted to think different, but it's something that has to be nurtured, that we can think imaginatively. And yet the healthy state is that all of that can still be held together with mutual respect. Oh God, I wish there were a lot more churches that were like that. To begin with, the early church was a much wilder place. I was going to say it was like the Wild West. In some ways it was, with different theologies jostling side by side. I mean, we see that even in the New Testament itself. And the impetus to unify church doctrine, to create orthodox beliefs over against so-called heretical beliefs, wasn't always spiritually motivated. When Christianity became the dominant faith in the Roman Empire, the Emperor Constantine saw that in order to hold together and unify his falling apart empire, he needed a unified church. And so it was Constantine who instigated the Council of Nicaea, out of which we get the Nicene Creed, with the motive of bringing that unity about, not just a unified church, but for him it was about having a unified empire. The early church was much messier than mostly it's imagined. And I like messiness. You should see my desk here. I like messiness. And our dear friend Mike Iaconelli, now sadly deceased, but was very popular at Greenbelt over the years, he wrote a brilliant little book called Messy Spirituality. And to be honest with you, I was quite annoyed when I saw he'd written this book. I've always kind of held it against him, because I would love to write a book with that title, Messy Spirituality, and he got in there first. But his point was that churches, denominations, organizations, and authorities like things to be tidied up, to be ordered, and so orthodoxy on all sorts of levels becomes a thing. But on the other hand, what Mike was saying is God's Spirit is all about messing things up, God's Spirit enjoys messing it up. God's Spirit, the very heart of God, is wild at heart. The general impression that you get in most churches, listening to most sermons, is that the Bible is like a cohesive whole, that, a single narrative runs right through it from Genesis to Revelation. And the way that that's mostly told in lots of churches goes a bit like this. The narrative goes from creation to the origins of sin and the need of salvation, the coming of Jesus, his death and resurrection, the birth of the church at Pentecost, which then went about converting people to Christianity. And then finally, you've got the return of Jesus, final judgment with Christians on the one hand going to heaven and all the rest over there going into the fire. Well, you see, it ain't like that. The Bible is not like that. And people who think that it is haven't actually taken the Bible seriously. That kind of narrative that I've just described, and it can vary in different ways, but any kind of narrative that is pretending to be, a systematized whole is really an imposition on the biblical text. Well, 66 books actually. And the text itself is much messier and much more unsystematic than that. And I love it. I love the Bible because of its messiness, because of its unsystematicness. The Bible actually is a wild book. And if we learn to read it for the wild book that it is, instead of having somebody flatten it all about, and the bits that stick out, the bits that kind of, rub, that don't quite fit, that feel awkward, that that you react against, rather than kind of flattening them all out and giving them a nice little explanation, that says, oh no, but and those people, they have an explanation for all the difficult bits of the Bible, and what they're doing is domesticating a wild book. And I think that when we read it as a wild book, then I think we'll enjoy it much more and we'll find it much more instructive. But it'll also get our hackles up and we'll want to fight with it, and that's a good thing, I say. I mean, the Bible itself speaks of God variously as darkness, yeah, it does, as well as light. Speaks of God as cloud, fire, a hammer, an abyss, wind, shepherd, judge, father, nursing mother, lover, voice in a bush, and a whole lot more. The Bible is packed full of metaphors to speak of God, some of which, if we're honest, we like, and some of which not so much. I really love a book which somebody passed on to me recently by Mark Wallace, which is called When God Was a Bird, in which he argues that the holy dove, God became a dove, that dove actually is really a pigeon. And I really like that a lot, because I've often thought of launching a pigeon liberation front to defend it against the flying vermin brigade. But it's a lovely book that's really sort of saying, God appears in many forms. There are lots of metaphors within nature that speak of God. And they're not all as appealing as some of the others are. But biblical metaphors for God are not enough. We don't have enough of them in the Bible. It's only the beginning. And the reason I think we need many more metaphors rather than less for God, some of which will clash and be ambiguous and disturbing, is that God is infinitely greater and far less definable than religion dares to contemplate. And sometimes, in order to try and get to grips with God, we have to sort of, juxtapose ones that are really appealing with ones not so appealing, because we're dealing with that which is beyond our normal comprehension. We have domesticated God mostly into that caricatured supernatural big guy in the sky, when the reality that we grapple with is mysterious, paradoxical, oft-times puzzling, sometimes annoying, never containable, but always, always, always the fount of life and the ground of being. Beloved friends, God is wild. We need to acknowledge that, and then, believe it or not, things will become much simpler, because we've acknowledge that all the marvellous and horrible words and creeds and doctrines that we come up with are never going to suffice. Instead, we'll enter the incredible, never-ending, big conversation in which I will continue to argue passionately for the truth as I see it, whilst also, I hope, being big enough to say, but I could be wrong. So let's keep talking. Let's keep listening. Let's keep the conversation going. That, friends, is a living tradition. Tradition isn't, here is the truth in this little package, and I pass it to you and you pass it to them and so on ad nauseum. No. Tradition is, a flowing river, a vibrant, gushing river with all sorts of currents and other things coming in with turbulence. And I think that needs to be reflected much more. That is the rewilding of religion that I would like to see. And that's precisely what we shall do, dear Shedsters, on another day. We will carry on the conversation about these wonderful things. Meanwhile, here is a prayer. And I think you might know where the source of this is. Wild thing. Wild thing, you make my heart sing. Sometimes I think I know you, and then I'm pretty sure I don't. And yet this I do know for sure. The world is crammed with your beautiful, puzzling, mind-blowing presence. Wild thing, you make everything groovy, even when it's dark and I can't see a hand in front of me. It's not that the darkness disappears, more that the darkness itself gleams tiny particles of assurance, and my heart says, all shall be well. Wild thing, I think I love you. Though even when I'm not sure, I know it doesn't matter. You still hold me in your love, and even when I try to tame you with my ridiculous desire for certainty, you draw me back into faithful doubt again. Amen. Okay, well, I've got a little drink here. If you've got one, just a quickie. If you join me, I'd like to join you to join me in a toast to wild things in nature, wild things in our life that sometimes we wish we could control. But in the end, it's all part of the rich pattern of life, the changing seasons of life. A toast to the wild thing, the God revealed to us in Jesus, in nature and in a million different ways, to wildness, to life, L'chaim. Fantastic, there you go. If you like all this, if you like what I'm doing here in the Holy Shed, you can support us. You can buy us a coffee. All you have to do is follow the link which is on the screen. It's also always at the top of the posts on the Holy Shed page. And friends, we are so grateful for all the help and support that you give us. It's fantastic. And there it is, I think. Thursday this week at 7:30, I shall be leading a soul space along with our friends in Croydon. I'll be putting a post up about that beforehand. Maybe Peter will be listening and put one up in the comments anyway. But I look forward to sharing another soul space with you. It's always a lot of fun, and hopefully it's stimulating and encourages our imagination to get working. So there it is. That's it. I've got a blessing here, which has a line in it that I think you'll be familiar with and you'll like. The blessing of God, the eternal goodwill of God, the shalom and salam of God, the wildness and warmth of God, be among us and between us now and always. Amen. So that's it, guys. Go well. Have a great week. Be kind to the world. Be kind to the wildness of the world. Be kind to yourself. Welcome your own wildness. Stay human. And I'll see you soon. And You can keep looking at this blessing and enjoy a little music.